You are entering the realm between the hidden and forgotten. A slipstream caught between realities. A secret museum of the esoteric. The private library of shadows. All taking place in a world forged from mystery and caught between logic and myth. You are entering Parareality.
My guest tonight is Dr. Richard Gallagher. He's a board-certified psychiatrist, professor of psychiatry at New York Medical, and a psychoanalyst on the faculty of Columbia University. He graduated from Princeton University, Phi Beta Kappa in classics, and trained as a resident in psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine. He's in the world's foremost expert on the subject of diabolic attacks, and he's been an active member of the International Association of Exorcists since the 1990s. He lives in Westchester, New York, and is the author of the book Demonic Foes, My 25 Years as a Psychiatrist Investigating Possessions, Diabolic Attacks, and the Paranormal. This book's gotten a lot of really good reviews, and it's even been called a thought-provoking read, sure to attract intrigued skeptics and believers alike. It's even in development for a major film by Jason Blum from Blumhouse Productions. That's the production company behind movies like Paranormal Activity, Insidious, and The Purge. Very impressive. Welcome to Parareality, Dr. Gallagher.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Yes, sir. I have been looking forward to this for a while now, and we've been trying to work it out. I had to cancel a couple of times and reschedule. So I'm very happy that we finally got our schedules worked out and you could be on the podcast with me.
Well, good.
So I have a ton of questions, and I'm going to start out by saying you have an impressive background, Yale University, and you've been on you're on the faculty of Columbia University, and you've been since the 1990s on the International Association of Exorcists. Now, you are not an exorcist yourself, right?
No, absolutely. I'm not an exorcist.
Okay.
I am a psychiatrist who does primarily pro bono evaluations of people for different clergy. Primarily Catholic clergy, but I've done it for actually clergy and people of all religions. And, because of Zoom and telephones, I probably have seen more of these genuine cases than any physician in history. Because of modern communication ability. But I also rule out, people who just mistakenly think they're demonically attacked.
Right.
Again, when I talk about these cases, keep in mind these are not patients of mine.
Right. There are people that you have been contacted by another person to interview.
Usually, yeah.
And how did you get invited to investigate these suspected cases of demonic possession?
Well, I always emphasize that I never volunteered. And I, to tell you the truth, I don't think this is a good field to volunteer in.
No.
Long story short, I had finished my residency at Yale, and I was working at the time for Cornell Medical College as an academic psychiatrist, which I am, as well as a clinician. In fact, I primarily regard myself as a clinician. And this kind of rumpled-looking priest, Catholic priest, who was also a prominent exorcist at the time. And at a time when they're actually, it's not that long ago, but it's a time where there were still very few Catholic exorcists in America.
Okay.
So this guy and his colleague, who I especially worked with, eventually would, consult on a lot of cases and deal with a lot of cases. And so they gave me quite an education over the next few years after originally this guy coming to my office out of the blue, knocking on my door and saying, Dr. Gallagher, I know you're a Catholic and a psychiatrist, and we would be interested in knowing whether you would be willing to see a few cases and help us figure out, if this is something medical or psychiatric, or whether this is generally demonic. And that is a evaluation that is often required, at least in the Catholic Church, by different dioceses, and even, has gone on for centuries. In other words, even in the manual for exorcists, which is called the Rituale Romanum, or the Roman ritual, sort of very strongly urges, when there is any doubt, physicians should be brought into the assessment process. So anyway, I said to him, and I had just lived through an era. I don't know if you're familiar with the term satanic panic.
Oh yeah.
There was this panic that Satanists were all over the place and kidnapping, 50,000 children a year. I mean, an expert figured out that there weren't even 50,000 missing children in a year, and that in fact, most of those kids were runaways. So there had been a tremendous exaggeration about Satanists. I mean, in some ways, there still is in America. There's, people who think, Satanists run the government and all that. And I won't get into the politics, but, that there are these subcultural hysterias that periodically occur, going back to, the stuff in Europe, where, witches were getting, centuries ago, witches were, thought to be roaming everywhere.
Right.
So long story short, I said to the priest, I said, well, with all due respect, Father, and he was a very intelligent, erudite guy. I said, with all due respect, I'm a little skeptical of some of these stories.
Yeah.
I remember him saying to me with a smile, he said, well, then you're the perfect man for the job, because he wanted someone who was skeptical. In other words, he didn't want somebody who was gonna either dismiss the subject, which I didn't, nor did he want someone who, was going to see the devil everywhere.
Right.
Reminds me of, C.S. Lewis's attitude, if you've ever read him. He said there are two errors when you're dealing with the subject of the demonic. The first is to dismiss the idea altogether and deny that there's a demonic realm. And the second error is to, exaggerate their significance and, think that they're responsible for all the evil in the world. There was a famous Catholic philosopher, theologian, who was an expert in this area, and he said, trust me, human beings are perfectly capable of evil on their own.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. So what are the criteria that you use to differentiate between mental illness, such as things like dissociative disorder, psychosis, or personality disorders, and demonic possession?
Well, you've listed three good examples of what has to be ruled out. So first of all, as a very experienced psychiatrist, I want to make sure that someone doesn't just have a mental illness.
Right.
Psychotic patients, for instance, can have hallucinations of demons. People with dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder,
Right.
sometimes elaborate what they call an alter that pretends to be a demon, or that they imagine delusionally as a demon. And then there are the different types of personality disorders where someone is struggling with a lot of dark impulses, destructive feelings, aggressive feelings, or in the case of, one of the personality disorders that we call sociopathy, actually dealing with, true evil feelings and behavior. So all these things have to be ruled out. In past centuries, sometimes people thought that epileptics or people with Tourette's disease were possessed. So, the first thing to answer your question is that you have to make sure the person is not suffering from mental illness. And the second thing is which is equally important, is to truly do a rigorous discernment that there is something fairly unequivocally giving evidence of a foreign spirit in the individual or attacking the individual. So let's talk about possession. I mean, there are different types of demonic attacks. Possession is the most dramatic. You really have to see the activity of a demon in the case of what we believe is going on. And how do you do that? Well, again, you or the people who surround this person, or sometimes the individual themselves, the victim, I call them, they're often aware that very strange things are happening. Now, in modern terminology, we often call this the paranormal, but the paranormal is a modern term. I am very committed to science, and I regard the term paranormal, it's a useful term, but it's somewhat of a pseudoscientific term. In other words, it's what modern observers sort of say, well, we can't figure it out, so let's call it the paranormal. It's essentially referring to non-material realities. Now, sometimes those, realities are hoaxes or misperceptions or hallucinations or this sort of thing. But in a certain amount of cases, I mean, most serious students of human nature realize that there are phenomena that appear to be observed by a lot of different people throughout history. In fact, massive amounts of people, educated people, non-educated people, both. And that the explanation is not well explained by material science. And again, I want to emphasize that as a physician, of course, I'm very committed to science. And I believe in the Big Bang. I believe in evolution. I believe in the findings of modern science. I couldn't do my work without scientific grounding.
Right. Yeah.
Having said that, there are these phenomena that cannot be explained by the modern methods of scientific experimentation and that sort of thing. What is sometimes technical about it is called methodological naturalism. And these phenomena are, in my opinion, and certainly in the teachings of my church, they are essentially spiritual type of phenomena, and they're either good spirits or they're bad spirits. So they are either what we would technically call, again, in Catholic terminology, the supernatural or the preternatural being the realm of the demonic. And that encompasses, a lot of phenomena throughout history.
Yeah.
I mean, miracles, for instance. I have a good friend who wrote a massive study of miracles throughout the history of the church. He's a Protestant theologian and friend of mine called Craig Keener. He has this magisterial work of miracles throughout history. I mean, a lot of people would call that stuff the paranormal, but, we Christians would call it the supernatural. Then there's, a number of works. I could cite them, but, I write about them in my book, Demonic Foes. There are many studies, including my own, where, we're reporting a lot of demonic phenomena throughout history. Mm-hmm. It reminds me of a woman I dealt with, and she was one of these rare Satanist women. That's the character that Jason Blum is going to make a movie about. And she was flamboyantly possessed, and she had different psychic powers. I can give some examples in a minute if you want.
Sure.
And she said to me once, she said, well, people think I'm gifted. And she said, there are no gifted people. There are only people who have favors. And, she did believe in God, although she claimed not to really understand God. And she was more comfortable literally worshiping Satan. She was one of these rare people who were truly Satan worshipers. And she said, there's only two people. You get these psychic powers either from above, from God, or you get these powers from below, And it struck me as an apt summary of what I'm saying, that the paranormal, in its legitimate phenomena, when not simply misperceptions, is usually either supernatural or preternatural.
So, in your professional opinion, why do you feel like there is a certain, what I feel is a large majority of people who are having these, for lack of a better term, psychotic breaks? Why does religion seem to come into this, where people think that they're hearing the voice of God, or they think that they're Jesus or some other religious figure?
Well, again, if they think they're Jesus, they're usually psychotic. But I understand. I've dealt my whole life. I mean, my job as a physician is to help suffering people, and
Mhm.
I've dealt with literally thousands of psychotic individuals. So we're not talking here about psychotic individuals. What we're talking here is people who have this unequivocal demonstration of something, paranormal. For
Mhm.
instance, people who have the ability to reveal hidden things about people, what we call
Yeah.
occult knowledge, or people who all of a sudden a voice will come out of them and they will speak foreign languages that they had never studied. Demons, in fact, are quite intelligent, and they know pretty much all languages throughout history. That they're that intelligent, and they've been observing us since the dawn of man. So, I often say to people that, how many patients do you know who all of a sudden start speaking perfect Latin, or who
Yeah.
can tell you things like, this Satanist woman told me how my mother died, but she also had all kinds of other knowledge of people's, lives. She could actually see people at a distance. That's what the
Wow.
para, that's what the parapsychologists call remote viewing. And she demonstrated these things, to me, certainly to my satisfaction. So when the demon manifests, in addition to um, exhibiting these paranormal powers, which this woman could exhibit even when she was not in a trance of a possession, and did not want to give up these powers, by the way. The demon itself will often show tremendous hostility to anything sacred or religious. So, for instance, they will, curse and I guess the word would be blaspheme about anything religious. They curse
Yeah.
God. They curse holy objects. They sometimes have the ability to, destroy holy objects. I mean, again, that's not mental illness. That's not psychosis.
Yeah.
So there has to be this very strong evidence. Believe me, I'm reasonably, as a person, I'm a reasonably skeptical person, and it takes a lot to convince me. But when you've seen enough of these cases, as I have, you realize there's a pattern here, there's a syndrome, and the
Yeah.
syndrome shows absolute evidence of a spirit that has powers beyond normality. And number two, expresses itself as hating God and religion. Almost all cultures, by the way, as you may be aware, have reported cases of possession. Now,
Yeah.
sometimes they make mistakes, or they have I would say, a theoretical structure which misinterprets it as some type of superstitious thing, like I'm possessed by a dead soul, or I'm possessed by
Yeah.
an ancestor, or that sort of thing. Um, what has always convinced me as well is that under the influence of a genuine exorcism, uh, these demons who often pretend they're something else, and they may pretend they're an ancient god, or they may pretend they're Hitler or Judas Iscariot or something.
Yeah.
Under the influence of a successful series of exorcisms, they are forced, against their will, by the way, they are forced to reveal their real name, and then they name themselves as the demonic entity that they are. I mean, that's an invariable pattern, and it's a good sign because it often means that the person will soon be delivered.
Okay. So once you get the demon to admit who they really are, that's like the writing's on the wall. The person's just on the way towards.
It's a part of the process, and it's sort of an indication that they are being forced. We Christians believe by our Lord, they're being forced by the Lord to do something they don't want to do, because all throughout history they have hidden under the guise of pretending they're someone else or something else. I often tell people, I was a student of classics at Princeton, as you mentioned, and I was very struck by the story of the Delphic Oracle. People would come from all over the Mediterranean world to speak to her, and she clearly was the repository of, you might say, secret information. But the actual phenomena that she exhibited is she would be this, uneducated peasant woman who would go into a trance, and out of her mouth would come this different voice using her vocal cords, but it would be the voice professing to be Apollo. And, even though some of that stuff was even understood at the time to be superstitious, there were plenty of ancient people who believed in the gods. In fact, most cultures have believed in deities. And, pre the triumph, you might say, of Judaism, Christianity, and the Muslims, all of whom believe evil spirits are fallen angels, or at least throughout much of their history. So these demons will often pretend to be something like an ancient god, and that's exhibited very well by the story of the Delphic Oracle, who would go into a trance and then would not remember what she said. I mean, that's a possession. And that, in that case, is a voluntary possession. There are these different types of possessions.
So you can invite something to come possess you for a finite period of time for whatever reason.
Oh, you can hope that they come in for a finite period of time.
Right.
You're sort of playing with fire. It's not a very sensible thing to do. But
you don't have any control over the time.
Yeah, but there are people who have had that ability. For instance, the MS-13 gangsters, who are kind of devil worshippers of sorts. They sometimes, and this has been reported many times in newspapers and stuff, they will have one of their members invite an evil spirit in. That evil spirit will give them, knowledge, say, about their enemies, and then, after that, the spirit seems to leave. So, there are these different types of possessions, and sometimes it's voluntary. Mostly the cases I write about and the people who want help, most of the time that's involuntary.
Involuntary, yeah, that makes sense. So, have you experienced any backlash, either personally or professionally, because of your involvement with this?
I would say in general, no, which surprises people.
Yeah, it is a little surprising.
I'm a fairly well-trained, I think, well-respected psychiatrist, and we live in a very pluralistic country. We live in a very religiously tolerant country. So I'm sure that there are, colleagues who disagree with my views, but it's not like they make a crusade about it.
Yeah.
And knock on wood, I mean, I try to protect myself spiritually and have people pray for me. In fact, I'm going to ask your audience to pray for me because I'm shameless in asking for people's prayers. So I feel a little bit protected. There is always little, and if you talk to any experienced deliverance minister or exorcist, they will say there's always little stuff that happens. For instance, many exorcists have told me that phone calls and electronic equipment that they use sometimes goes a little haywire.
Yeah.
I have had that happen to me. I appeared on a television show with some good Christian ladies, and they told me right before the show, they said, Dr. Gallagher, I don't know what's with it today, but our studio has never had more technical problems than we have today. So that kind of stuff can happen, and it has happened a little bit to me, but nothing catastrophic.
Well, we had some technical difficulties before we started this interview, so I wonder if that has anything to do with it. I
You
didn't
never
think
know.
about that. Never know. So, being a Catholic such as yourself, have you have your experiences changed or affected your beliefs at all?
Well, I was brought up Catholic, and like a lot of young people, I questioned things for a while, and but it's not like I ever went through a period where I questioned a belief in God or something. But I would say that over the years, dealing with these many cases, as I said, I've probably seen more of these cases than any physician in history. It absolutely deepens and strengthens your faith. I mean, it's very hard for me to, not to accept the teachings of the church about
Yeah.
evil spirits, for instance. And when you read the Gospels, and of course, Jesus was the great exorcist of all time in our view. It sort of validates, because the kind of things he was dealing with are the same type of things that the modern people in the churches and in other religions too have to deal with. So it certainly validates the accuracy of those reports, in my opinion.
Well, before I ask my next question, I can certainly see how doing something like this would deepen your faith. It makes total sense that it would solidify, your what your current beliefs are, or maybe even goes so far as if you were at a point to where I'm not sure, maybe, maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. I can see where this would help you make up your mind. So it makes perfectly good sense to me that it would deepen your faith. And even though that you yourself we've already established that you're not an actual exorcist, but do you feel that by participating in what you're doing here, do you feel that you're opening yourself up to receive a demonic attack, or maybe even be possessed yourself?
Well, I mean, it goes back to your question about whether I've been harassed myself. I would say in general, no. And I do believe that a good spiritual life and striving for goodness in your life in general is protective. Um, this sort of thing doesn't just happen to anyone. So it's not like people should wake up in the morning and worry that they got possessed during that night.
Yeah.
It usually is. It affects at least possessions, and there are some exceptions for more minor attacks, what we sometimes call oppressions. But with possessions, the victim, and I do regard them as victims because they get in over their head. They often have had to invite the spirit in some way, consciously or not, because but if they turn to occult forces, like get involved in black magic or unsavory activities, and I would include things like mediums and fortune tellers. If somebody gets involved in that stuff, they kind of, to use the lingo, they can open a door. Also, people who turn to evil. I write about a guy in my book named, I call him Juan. None of these names are accurate because I disguise their identity, and with their permission often have told their stories. However, all the facts that I discuss in the book about these cases are 100% accurate. And Juan was a gangster, and he was a criminal, and he later realized how much he had turned to evil, and he had even turned to sort of this occult devil cult of Santa Muerte, holy death. And he claimed that, Satan himself gave him a lot of successful trappings of a criminal life, but then got arrested. He was put in prison, and the prison chaplain legitimately discerned that he was possessed. So that would be a good example of what happens to a person who truly gets possessed.
Yeah.
I often tell people something which surprises them, because I'm talking about people who have never been patients of mine, even though I've seen a lot of these people, and I've been to a couple of hundred exorcisms as well. But during the course of my life as a very busy clinician, I'm still very busy. I've seen about 27,000 people in my life.
Wow.
As psychiatric patients. These are as patients. Mm-hmm. In different settings. And for a while, I was emergency director for my county. Now, I want you to take a guess. How many of those people have I thought were possessed, of those 27,000 patients?
I would say probably a small number.
A very small number, none.
Yeah. Really?
Of those 27,000 people, I've never said any of them are possessed. So you can understand that I believe that possession is a rare thing. Now, why have I been able to write about these things and give quite a few examples? It's again because people from all over the world have contacted me, and I've assessed people based on often clergy reports that there is something weird going on with them. So that's a very selected population, but those are not patients. So by contrast, of those cases, a reasonably high percentage do in fact have something demonic.
Okay, so I'm glad you made that distinction, because I was about to ask you about that. So what you're saying is patients are those people that you are seeing on a let's just say a professional level. Correct. They are coming to you, or you're being assigned to them in the hospital or whatever. Right. And what you do with the exorcisms in the church, you do not consider those people to be patients.
Exactly. And they're not patients. I mean, they're not legally. They're not patients of mine. I mean, if they need, because it's a stressful thing to be possessed, let me assure you. Yeah. If they need support, I try to help them get support from someone else, but I'm not treating them.
So you're not bound by HIPAA whenever you're evaluating those people?
Well, it's not really a question of HIPAA, because number one, they're not my patients. Right. And number two, they've given me permission to talk about them. Okay. So it's, again, I don't have a physician relationship with them, as they well know. And they're not asking me to treat them. I mean, I'm just doing, voluntary evaluations.
Evaluations, right.
They're voluntarily, talking to me. I mean, they often are extremely grateful that, I have validated their perception or the perception of their clergy. And with the International Association, which is approved by the Vatican, for a while, I had served on their governing board, and I'm still sort of a scientific advisor for them of sorts. In fact, this coming September, for a repeated time, I'm going to address about 500 exorcists in the world.
Wow.
And I always mention, when people ask about the evidence for this thing, I say, well, there are a lot of cultural anthropologists who have written about these things, although sometimes from an agnostic point of view. Mm-hmm. I wrote a book presenting my experiences with quite a number of possessed cases, in part because, I got asked to do that. It's not something that I particularly volunteered to do either. And I also, felt it would be a service to the educated public, as well as alert people about the reality of the stuff, and where to turn to for help, because some of these individuals have no idea where to turn to. And I can't see, I can't see everybody who contacts me. So
Right.
I wanted to put down my thoughts in a book. But I often tell people too, I said, look, I'm a professor and a board certified physician. I'm not going to write a book and just make up stories, because
Yeah.
there are people who do that, by the way. And, I won't mention any names, but there are people who have just made up stories in this area. Everything
That's a good way to ruin your reputation.
well, in addition, it would be sort of a crazy thing for me to do. But I tell people, you don't have to believe me, even if I'm persuasive to a lot of people, and I have been persuasive to a lot of people. I have a good Jewish physician friend of mine who, he said, this book blows me away. He said, I never knew you did this, Rich, and I'm telling you, no one can say that a scientifically trained physician hasn't made a very good case for evil spirits. That was kind of the reaction I wanted from an educated reader. But again, I say, it's not my job to convince people. It really isn't. I mean, God gives us the evidence He wants to give us. I mean,
Right.
you can't do experiments on these people. When people try to videotape them, they're often unsuccessful.
Yeah.
But I say, you don't have to believe me. I say every 2 years, I go to a meeting with 500 exorcists. Talk to any of them. They all have stories similar to mine. These are Catholic exorcists.
Yeah.
And many of them have written books. So it's not like you have to believe, Dr. Gallagher. If I can make one religious analogy, which I often do, at the risk of getting a little religious for a minute,
That's fine.
I say, you don't have to believe me. You can believe any of these 500 exorcists who are perfectly happy to talk about this stuff openly, as I am. And that's very similar to St. Paul. When St. Paul went to the Corinthians, which would be a little bit like, I suppose, a preacher from, and in his case, a former rabbi from Alabama going to San Francisco or something.
Yeah.
And what he said to these sophisticated Corinthians, he said, well, I know that Jesus rose from the dead. He said, in part because he appeared to me, knocked him off a horse. I mean, this was not just, supposedly, and, made him mute for a while. He was absolutely convinced this was Jesus. This was not just some hallucination. But he said, you don't have to believe me. He said, there are 500 people. I mean, this is right in the letter to the Corinthians. He said, there are 500 people who saw him. He said, and they're still alive. He said, if you don't believe me, go talk to them. It's a strong argument, in my opinion. Doesn't convince everybody, but it underscores my point that, in fact, if you look at the total evidence, even though these cases are rare, and most doctors, even most priests, by the way, are never going to see a case of possession. But if you look at the total evidence throughout history, the evidence is actually quite massive. And again, you don't have to take just my word for it.
Do you think that the cases of demonic possession are on the rise?
I mean, you never really know. It's not like anybody, has the definitive answer in that. And there are some countries, for instance, in Haiti and Madagascar, people have been reporting many cases of possessions for centuries. And, if you ask them, do you believe in evil spirits? You ask that of a Haitian or, a native of Madagascar, they'll say, I certainly do, because I've, So it sort of depends. When people sometimes say to me, well, as a psychiatrist, how does it feel to be out of the mainstream? And I say, well, it's not the job of psychiatrists normally to diagnose spiritual problems. So I understand that. And I also understand that psychiatrists who see a lot of psychotic individuals are going to kind of think the whole thing is, just crazy people.
Mhm.
But I said, exactly what mainstream are you talking about? I said, if you take American society, even though there's been a decline in Christian beliefs, the majority of Americans not only believe in God, they also believe in the devil. So I'm not out of the mainstream there. If you look at world history, the vast majority, and around the world even today, the vast majority of human beings believe in evil spirits. Now, are some of them superstitious? Sure. Sometimes do they make mistakes? Sure.
Yeah.
But I mentioned to people my book has been translated in so far 3 other languages: Spanish, Polish, but also in Japanese. And East Asians who are not, certainly the Japanese who are not particularly Christian, they have a very active belief in evil spirits. That's why the book is selling well there too.
Yeah.
So, I don't exactly see myself as out of the mainstream, but it depends on what the audience is.
So can you since we're talking about book and everything, can you tell me how this book came about?
Well, a lot of individuals, including exorcists, by the way, asked me to write my experience because um, they thought it might help people, not only people who might suspect they were affected, but also, might have mental illness. And
Mhm.
so they and clergy could discern better, which cases were mentally ill and which cases, needed more spiritual help. I also wrote it for the educated public who might just find this subject, which is a little convoluted, might find
Yeah.
this subject of interest. Um, so, I decided to write up my experience with the permission of some of the cases I talk about. And, it's sort of become a bestseller.
I was going to ask you how your book sales were going, and you just answered that question. So
Yeah,
that's good.
it's sold pretty well. It has what
Good.
they call a long tail. In other words, that's the publishing lingo for it keeps selling. You know,
Good.
uh, some novels or so may sell very well for a couple of
Yeah.
months, but this has been out now almost 2 years, and it still
Wow.
sells very well. And
Good.
as
Well,
I said,
congratulations on it.
they are going to make a movie out of the case of the Satanist woman that I write about at length in chapter 3 of the book.
Yeah,
And
and I wanted to touch on that a little bit. Um, when did tell me about being approached by this A-list Hollywood filmmaker and
well,
how did
Jason Blum, to use the New York Yiddish term, is a big mocker, meaning a very powerful player in Hollywood, and
Mhm.
he I was put in contact with him, and he said, Rich, this is the hottest intellectual property I've ever seen. So he loved the story, and he made me an offer, and I don't particularly do this for the money, but he was willing tell to tell me that he would make a credible movie. He made me executive producer, by the way, which is,
well, that's good. That gives you some control.
yeah, it gives me some control. I mean, executive producer is sort of a position where it is what they allow you to do.
Yeah.
It's not like I have full control, but I
Yeah.
hope to make a credible movie. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, and I'm hoping that it'll come out in about a year or two.
So is it in what they call pre-production right
Yeah, it's
now?
kind of in pre-production. There's a very fine director who did the movie Spotlight, which won the Academy Award. That was about the Boston abuse of priest situation, which was
Mhm.
a tragedy. but his name is Tom McCarthy. He's the director, and he's very involved in, putting the pieces together.
And do you have any actors that, or is there anything you can tell me about, like who's going to be in it? Or
It hasn't reached the stage, who's
okay,
going to play me. I originally did not want to be portrayed as a character in the movie, and then Jason said to me, "Well, look, you're an integral part of the story. You got to be."
yeah, there's no way you can't be.
So,
Well, good luck with that, man. I'm looking forward to that coming out. And is what made him pick that one particular story? Obviously, you can't, make a one movie that has everything in the book in it. But what made that one particular story stick out to him? Do you know?
Well, that story is amazing. I mean, it's and again, that was a couple of years after the priest originally had talked to me about a case. This was what it was described by the two exorcists involved, both of whom are now deceased, but had become good friends of mine by that time. This is a case that they themselves described as a once in a century case.
Wow.
If you think about the unique features of the case, number one, she was a practicing Satanist, which again is rare. I'm not seeing Satanists all over the place.
Yeah.
So she had this incredibly dramatic possession with all kinds of demonstrated features of the paranormal, like, superhuman strength during the exorcisms, speaking foreign languages, but even outside the exorcisms, being able to describe to me people from a distance, having all kinds of secret knowledge. So it was a very dramatic case. And she actually specifically, I think she respected doctors. In fact, she respected doctors more than priests, who she sometimes mistreated. She'd had some bad experiences with priests, unfortunately. And, she said to me before she told me she was dying, that I could write about her story. So that's kind of a unique combination of factors. I often tell the story of how I first met her. The priest was very eager for me to see her, not because they were confused about her being possessed. They had no doubt. And she had already been evaluated by mental health people, and everybody was in agreement that she had a dramatic possession. In fact, I witnessed, several times demonic voices coming out of her, very crude and very arrogant voices. And but the way I got to meet her for the first time, I had been told by the priest that they wanted me to try to talk to her, again, pro bono, talk to her about why she was so ambivalent about getting exorcism, which she was, in part because she was afraid that she would literally be killed by the cult if she turned to the church. So this was sort of a hairy case. Yeah. But what happened is, my wife and I, with our two cats, were in the bedroom of our house, and just one night, in the middle of the night, these cats went berserk. They just started fighting each other, clawing each other, almost like trying to destroy each other. We had to separate them, and we wondered, was this some catnip, or was this
what's going on?
Bad food or something? Why did they go berserk? But we separated them and went back to sleep. The very next morning, again, unknown to me that this was going to happen, this priest who originally came to my office at Cornell, he said he rings the doorbell, and he brought this woman to my house.
Oh.
And he introduces me to her, and the first things out of her mouth were, "Well, Dr. Gallagher, I've heard a lot about you. Oh, by the way," she says this with a smirk, "oh, by the way, how did you like those cats last night?" Now, I had never met her before, so somehow she knew about that. Now, I was a little annoyed at her for, I'm thinking whatever crazy way she involved in this. I was also annoyed at the priest, and I said to him later, I said, Father, with all due respect, I'm trying to be of help to you and the church, but with all due respect, do not bring a Satanist to my neighborhood.
I don't blame you.
He apologized profusely about, and his excuse was, look, she had come to town. She didn't live in our area, in the New York area, and she had come to town, and he said, I really wanted, you to get to see her as soon as possible.
Good intentions, just not the best way to go about it. So, in your opinion, Dr. Gallagher, what is Hollywood getting right about demonic possession, and what are they getting wrong? And I want to ask you too.
It depends on the movie.
Yeah.
Some of them are sort of credible.
I wanted to ask you if you had seen any of the movie series that had Ed and Lorraine Warren in it.
I knew the Warrens.
Yeah.
Well, I knew Lorraine. When this priest exorcist died, I met Lorraine at the funeral. She was very gracious, and she knew that we had been friends, so she gave me my commiseration. I liked her. The stories in the Conjuring series, perhaps reflect in part what Hollywood can get wrong. I mean, they're loosely based stories, but some of them are just ludicrous. They exaggerate, sensationalize. I'm hoping, I don't have 1,000% control, but I'm hoping that we do a very credible movie. And that's the danger of a lot of these Hollywood supernatural demonic. They exaggerate. But some of them, like for instance, the original Exorcist, some of them have, a fair kernel of truth, even though that was fictionalized. It portrayed the case of in real life a boy who clearly had been possessed from Maryland. So that movie in its own way, even though it was fiction, has more credibility. What I would say is what they mostly get wrong, though, is they act like exorcism is magic and that the priest is like a witch doctor and all he has to do is, say the right mumbo jumbo prayers and, the case is solved.
Throw some holy water.
More complicated than that.
Yeah.
First of all, any good priest is going to say exorcism is of value, and it's an important part of the integral process of people getting delivered at that level of severity of a demonic attack. Having said that, number one, it's not the exorcist himself who delivers the person, it's God or our Lord. And number two, the person has to work at it. It doesn't just happen, just as possessions don't happen out of the blue to anybody, but only these people who have, the cliche is open door. But also the individual has to work at it. They have to reform their life. A very good example would be the Satanist woman I talked about versus the gangster. The gangster was eventually delivered by a series of successful exorcisms, but he also worked at it. In other words, he had been brought up Catholic. He returned to the church and the sacraments, and he reformed his life, and he admitted that he was sorry for all the evil he had done as a gangster. Whereas, by contrast, the Satanist woman, who I call by the pseudonym Julia, she refused to turn to God. I mean, she continued to sort of bank on, her supposed friendship with Satan, a Faustian bargain, if there ever was one. And in part, it's also because she was afraid. She was afraid of leaving the cult. She claimed that she had been in love with the leader of the cult. She claimed that if she left the cult, that she would be severely punished and maybe even killed. So eventually she got too scared she resisted continuing exorcism. She had a few, but it didn't lead to a definitive determination, and so she dropped out, and so she was never delivered. And later I got a call from her telling me that she was dying.
Did she? So even after she was dying, she stuck to her guns and didn't.
Well, as far as I know, I mean, you leave it in God's hands. I mean,
Right.
somebody just because somebody is possessed doesn't mean they reject God. Ultimately, that they may at that point become more of a victim than a
Yeah.
willing participant. I don't happen to know the circumstances of her death, although she did tell me that she was dying of cancer.
So if there's anybody that's listening to this podcast who's experiencing what they think is a demonic attack, what is your advice as far as what they should do?
Well, they should seek, and I understand it's sometimes easier said than done. They should try to seek help from their locale. I mean, probably it would be sensible to talk to an educated clergy. Again, there are fundamentalist clergy who unfortunately seem to see the devil everywhere. So you have to be a little selective who you talk to. You want a sensible, sober person. And in many cases, they should also get some kind of medical or psychological evaluation. Now, it is true that a certain amount of mental health people are going to be in over their head about this.
Yeah.
They just automatically say, well, this person is psychotic. But if they keep persisting and pray about it, they usually are able to find some local people who have some expertise.
And I have a question that I promised my wife I would ask you. And I think I already know the answer to this, but I was telling her in prep for interviewing you today, we were talking about, she was asking me, who I was interviewing, and I was telling her who and a little bit about what I know about you. And she wanted to know, do you actively participate in any of the exorcisms? Are you present when they happen, or do you just do your evaluation and then
Well, I'm a busy
away?
guy, and as far as I know, there's only 24 hours in a day. So,
Right.
unfortunately, I can't see everybody who wants to see me. It's part of the reason I wrote the book, but I certainly can't attend all the exorcisms. I have been to about, and some of these were repeat exorcisms. I've been to about 200 exorcisms in my life as an observer, but that's
Wow.
all, just an observer. And sometimes they want a doctor there, which is not a bad idea.
Yeah.
But again, it's not like I'm conversing or shouting
Yeah.
command questions to the demon.
Right.
That I don't do.
Gotcha. You're not the exorcist. You're just the consultant for the
Correct.
person. I almost said patient, but we're not calling them patient.
It's important that people keep their proper roles.
Yes, sir. I agree.
It's important that a lot of really good exorcists are experienced enough that they can do most of the discernment on their own. But it's a prudent thing, and you have to be sensible and have your feet on the ground. It's often helpful that they do consult a mental health professional. And in a similar way, I think people easily, can sort of get in over their head and start to promote themselves as, well, I can drive out demons or I can command demons, which often ends badly.
I can see that. So, final question for tonight. Can you tell my listeners where they can find your book if they want to purchase it?
Well, like most other books around the world, I guess, the easiest way is just to go on Amazon. There's a wonderful, I think if you sign up for something, you can even get it for free, Audible version, which is narrated by a guy I know. I didn't like the narratives that they proposed, so I know this Shakespearean actor who has this incredible, powerful voice. And I said, why don't you ask him? And he was gracious enough to do the narration. So
Nice.
that's one option. I mean, it is out in paperback now, and you can easily
Okay.
get it from Amazon. And I'm told it's in most big bookstores now too.
Barnes and Noble, Books a Million.
I think, but again, I mean, you can certainly also get it from HarperCollins, which I think is the second biggest publishing company in the world. They're the ones who published it, and you can certainly get it at their website also. So it's a fairly easy book to purchase.
And now I know you're not a social media guy. Do you have a website or anything
No,
where people can
I
find?
intentionally am not a social media guy
Yeah,
because I would get inundated. I do not have a website. I'm not promoting,
okay,
this aspect of my life. I mean, I will say sort of that if people make a major effort, they seem to be able to find me.
yeah,
But I don't make it so easy. I certainly do not promote myself on any, website or
yeah.
anything like
It's probably a good thing that you don't do social media because it's just social media these days is awful. I have to say, it's just
that. Well, between the book and other writings I've done, I mean, I've had a lot of positive praise about what I do in the book, but I've also had the usual cowboy critics. So
yeah,
you can certainly read a spectrum of opinion if you look up my name. But I quite frankly, explicitly, I don't make it a simple thing to get a hold of me. Put it that way.
probably a good thing. Probably a good thing. Well, I certainly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be on this podcast this afternoon. And it's been a great interview. I learned a lot of stuff. And uh, I have talked to in the past a couple of people who claimed, I'm using my air quotes, that they were experts on demonic possession and exorcism in stuff of that nature. But you're the first person I've ever had the privilege to talk to who approaches it from a medical and a scientific side. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing to help those people coming from someone who is one medical professional to the other. I applaud you, and I'm so glad that there is someone out there such as yourself who is doing the work that they're doing. So
And I should also say, like, I'm probably more experienced than any other physician, uh, probably in the world, but it's not like there aren't other psychiatrists who have Christian backgrounds or Catholic backgrounds who are pretty knowledgeable too. So I'm not the only guy involved in this field. And the other thing is, yes, I try to approach it scientifically, and I tell people, and this is opposed to some fundamentalists. I tell people I am also grounded in science. I believe in science. I had a debate recently with a guy who was, kind of a what you would call a creationist and a science skeptic. And I said, well, God created the universe in complicated ways, and it's been around for 13.7 billion years from the Big Bang. And he said, Dr. Gallagher, how can you possibly believe in the Big Bang? It contradicts the Bible. And I said, number one, I absolutely disagree. You're misreading, the Bible. You're interpreting it too literally. And number two, I asked him, I said, do you know who came up with the theory of the Big Bang? Of course, he didn't know. It was a Belgian Catholic priest, a very devout priest, who came up with it about 100 years ago. And, he was an astrophysicist as well as a priest.
mm,
And it's interesting that Einstein originally did not believe him, because it involves this idea, which is, sort of compatible, although it doesn't prove, a created universe. But it certainly, propounds the idea that the universe is expanding, that sort of thing. And later in his life, Einstein says to people, that damn priest was right. So, the Catholic tradition has always been, and I would say the Orthodox Christian position has always been that, you can believe in both science and faith, and they don't contradict each other. That's certainly a major sub-theme of what I've tried to write about.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading your book. Admittedly, I haven't read your book yet, but after talking to you this afternoon, I'm definitely going to be hopping onto Amazon first thing and getting me a copy of your book. And I certainly appreciate you taking the time to appear on this podcast. Everyone, once again, this is Dr. Richard Gallagher. He is the author of the book Demonic Forces, My 25 Years as a Psychiatrist.
It's actually Demonic Foes, F-O-E-S.
Oh, it is foes. I'm looking at it and I just read it wrong. So let me redo that. This has been Dr. Richard Gallagher. He is the author of Demonic Foes, My 25 Years as a Psychiatrist Investigating Possessions, Diabolic Attacks, and the Paranormal. You can find it on HarperCollins.com or Amazon, which is probably the quickest and the easiest way to find it. Dr. Gallagher, thank you so much for not only the work you do, but for taking time out of your busy schedule to appear on my little podcast. And it's been a very, very nice conversation and an honor and a pleasure to speak to you today, sir.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and I appreciate a thoughtful interview such as you did.
Thank you very much, and I hope to be able to sit in the movie theater within the next couple of years and see your movie and say, I know the guy that did that, and maybe we can get you back on after that.
That would be my pleasure.
Thank you very much, sir. You have a good afternoon, and we'll be talking to you.
You too.
If you wish to change, you must first lift the veil of ignorance that has been cast over your eyes. Only then will you see the true power of the universe.